Okay, so let us get started. If I can get my thingy out of the way here, I don't want to see the chat. Maybe I can do that. There we go. Okay, so it's me again, same as Tuesday. I'm still the wildlife ecologist here at ORC. Last time I checked, that hasn't changed. And today we have quite a big crowd actually with us on site. So remembering John's issue last Tuesday about the sound, we'll make a plan. So if people have questions here, we'll just ask them to come closer to the microphone so everybody can hear. So this is the part 2 of the seminar entitled Webs, Cascades, Fangs. It is basically a story about keystone species. And on this part 2, we'll move on from part 1. So just a quick reminder, especially for people who were not here last Tuesday. On part 1, we discussed carnivores as keystone species. And using seabirds and the guano, we discussed the concept of food web and ecological niche. So this is basically the food web here in the pyramid. Using starfish and mussels, we actually discovered the ecological processes, bottom up and top down, who are regulating the food web, and set up the concept of a keystone species. And then via sea otters and killer whales, we define trophic cascade, which is basically describes the effect that keystone species have on the rest of the ecosystem, and that they don't only affect the levels that are just under them, below them in the pyramid, but they also affect all the level underneath. In part 2 today, we will actually move on land for a change, and we will look at the consequences of carnivores' extinction on land mainly and through the world, and the concept that is now gaining more and more traction, which is rewilding. First, we'll discuss and look at example of ecological meltdown. Then we discuss the concept of mesopredator release and the landscape of fear, which is a concept very close to my heart. I'm sure a lot of people here already heard me talking about it. And finally, when we're done with the doom and gloom, we'll talk about rewilding, which is basically a sliver of hope with the recovery of large carnivores, a bit in some ecosystem around the world, some natural, some a bit more human-driven. All right, so the first thing we'll do is we'll move out from our island and cold sea and follow John Therborg in the 90s when he arrived to Lago Guri in Venezuela. And in that place, basically what happened is they just built a dam 4 years before Therborg arrived, and that basically flooded the whole area, creating a whole archipelago of islands, each island of different size, different composition, and of different distance to the mainland, so more or less isolated. But most of them were too small to still harbor large predators. So by the time Therborg arrived in 1993, actually, some are already missing species compared to the mainland, and even more species are missing from the smaller islands. So none of them have predators anymore, but in some of them, many more species are missing than just predators. Before we get into what really happened on those islands, I need to give you a bit of background on the island biogeography theory. It describes basically to which is the number of species that we can expect an equilibrium on an island, depending on its size and its distance to the mainland. So what you see here is that you expect basically in terms of rate of colonization, a much faster rate for the islands that are close to the mainland. Obviously, they're closer, so it's easier for animals to get there. It's slower for islands that are far from the mainland. And it decreases with the number of species, because we're not talking about immigration of individuals, we're talking about immigration of a new species. So when an island already has a huge diversity, it's likely to be very similar to the mainland. So there's no really colonization of new species. On the other side of this, there is the rate of extinction. And that is basically species disappearing from the ecosystem. That rate is higher on small island compared to large island, and it increases as the island biodiversity becomes depleted. If we put these two together, this is typically the island biogeography theory. And then if we look at the bottom there, this is basically we obtain the highest diversity at equilibrium, remember, on the big island, that are near the mainland. So the ecosystem is the closest to the mainland. However, when we look at small island far from the mainland, so really the worst situation you can find yourself in as a species if you're stuck on there, it's that your rate of colonization is very low, your rate of extension is very high, and so there's biodiversity loss. So what John Therborgs and his students start to look at is on some of those islands, there seems to be a lot of bird species that are missing. And most of the birds that are missing have something in common, is that they're all ground nesting birds. On those islands, there are a lot of olive capuchin monkeys, and they are released from predation from their main predator, which is the jaguar, because the jaguars have all but gone for those islands. And what happened is those islands is basically freed from predation. The population of capuchin monkey has just increased a lot. And they also now forage on the ground. They don't need to hide in tree to be safe from jaguar, which leads to an increased egg depredation from those bird species that actually nest on the ground, which leads to a decrease in the population of ground bird species. Another example, we're just going to go through a few examples, is the example of the red owler monkey. So what happens for those monkeys? Same, the main predator has disappeared. And they usually in normal ecosystem, natural situation, they live in bands of 3 to 7 individuals that are led by an adult male, and they are called howler monkey because the males basically howl to advertise and maintain their territory. They are like a lot of apes, very social, so they groom each other, they play with each other, and even sleep on the same tree to just maintain cohesion in the group. With the disappearance of the main predators, their population greatly increased, and that has basically 2 main consequences. The first one that is obvious, it leads to an overconsumption of the vegetation, so overgrazing, which leads to a decrease in food availability. So those monkeys are starting to look very thin and malnourished, which also leads to problem in the immune system and parasite loads. But also plants actually can also defend themselves. We see that here in Africa with acacia, or should I say Vaccalia and Senegalias, who have developed thorns. It's actually a method of protecting themselves from being browsed. And there in the forest of Laruguri, the plants actually use a technique, a chemical defense, a bit like Mupanis here with tannin. And so they just produce a huge amount of those chemicals, which eventually make the monkeys sick. So monkeys have no choice but to eat those things, but then they are sick, they vomit, but they just still need to keep eating, otherwise there is nothing else to eat. Up to here, it's nothing really new. I mean, increasing population, overgrazing, we've seen that quite a lot in our previous example. But what's very interesting is that the social structure is completely disrupted as well. So the density reached about 20 to 30 times higher on that on the mainland, and there's basically no group cohesion anymore. They no longer play with each other. They actually violently fight and commit infanticides between the group. And they sleep on their own, on separate trees. And most importantly, they just don't howl anymore. So a forest that was usually full of sounds and howling monkeys advertising the territory is now a silent forest. There is no need to advertise because it's so disrupted that that message would get lost. So up to here, we've been talking actually about mammals, causing problems sometimes with birds, but we've been talking about big animals. And just to talk about, show the effect, the really very overbearing effect of the loss of large carnivores, that has also an effect on much, much smaller species. And in the case of Dlagoguri, on leaf-cutting ants. So those guys, they go out and cut leaf and bury them, and use them to feed and grow fungi on the plant matter. Same as a macrotermus here. So all the termite mound that you see here, they actually do not eat the vegetation matter that they collect. They bring it down and they eat the mushrooms that they grow. So they fungus grow. Main predator for those guys is not the big and furry this time. It's armadillo and army ants that actually have also slowly disappeared from those forests. And no surprise here, because of the disappearance of their predator, the population of leaf-cutting ants increases dramatically. And now also freed of the predator, instead of just roaming around at night, they also start roaming around during the day because there is no risk for them anymore. So there is a sharp decrease in or increase in the nutrient sequestration because now all the matter, the leaf matter is drawn underneath the ground, is stored in chambers in the ant's nest, and it's not accessible to vegetation anymore. So it's completely taken out of the energy web. And that leads to the fact that actually now plants turns their leaf to thorns. The trees who can't get to the nutrient and then can't support themselves are slowly replaced by vines, which means that there is no shade anymore on the ground, and there's just typically no seedling growth because, well, there's no shade, and also they get completely cut down by those ants. So basically, removal of those large predator and then enormous processes, bottom up and top down, that would happen naturally on this ecosystem leads to a complete transformation of the vegetation cover on those islands. And in the world of Therborg himself, he says that these observations are warning because the large predator that imposed top-down regulation have been extirpated from most of the continental United States and indeed much of the Earth's terrestrial realms. That was in the 90s, okay? So we're already fully aware that this is the removal of large predators having a big effect on ecosystem in general. Now, what happens is, like, here we had quite a simple system in a way, especially for mammals. There was just one top predator, the jaguar. Everybody here is probably thinking, yeah, but wait a minute, in Africa, there's lions and there are hyenas and there's leopards. In most ecosystems, actually, there are several species of predators, some of them bigger than others, some of them more dominant than others, and they all have interaction with each other as well. And so now the next question is, how does the disappearance of that top predator affect the predator that are underneath and then going down to the food chain? That is a question that was looked at in very much detail by Michael Soule in the 80s, so a bit before Therborg arrived to Laroguri, but they were actually knowing each other in correspondence. And Soule is working in the Chaparral in California, and this is basically how it looks there on the left. Kind of a Mediterranean landscape with bushes and those kind of things, no big trees. And in those brushes, there is a huge diversity of birds. That's just a few here. Don't ask me to name them. I have no idea what they're called. But it's just to give you an idea that there's a big diversity. What's happening in the Chaparral near San Diego, though, is that, well, San Diego is growing. And urbanization is happening very, very fast, which is destroying Chaparral and basically keeping some patches, pockets here and there of chaparral that are basically acting like islands. And so the idea that Soule has is, well, we can just test here right in front of us the island biogeography theory, because those islands are being created right as we study them. And those birds are isolated in those patches, which can be considered as island. So as Soule and his crew are combing through the chaparral birds, and they're looking how many species there are and how many individuals there are and what eats them and what doesn't eat them, they figured out that actually in the patches where there are more coyotes, there are more birds. And I was like, wait a minute, more carnivores, more prey? That kind of doesn't make sense. There's a missing link here. Well, the fact that the coyote population has been reduced in most of those pockets of the chaparral, because coyotes need a bit more space than just a few acres to survive. They're also not a very popular species in the States. We have hyenas, but they definitely have the coyotes. So the population are going down. And as they are going down, the population of what we call mesopredators, so the predators that are of smaller size, kind of your medium-sized predator, here that would be jackal, for instance, those populations are greatly increasing. And they're released from predation. And those guys are foxes and cats. And in relation to that, so Soule decides to say, well, obviously that's going to lead to increased predation, but what we want to do is look at what's happening with those cats. So they go to to cat owner and they ask them two things. So first, record what your cat is bringing home. And second, can we stick GPS collars on those cats to see where they go and what they do? So no surprise, bird population are crushed by cats. So super high predation, the bird population are decreasing. What's very interesting is when they start looking at where the collars end up. Well, about a quarter of those collars end up in coyote stomach. So coyotes are actually a predator from the cat. So not only direct predation, but also fear. And not only fear of the cat for the coyote, but of the cat owner from the coyote. And in response to that, now cat's owner was like, I'm not having that. I pay a vet bill for my cat. And it's going to end up being eaten by a coyote. That's it. That's done. My cat becomes an indoor cat. Problem sorted, because then cat doesn't go out and then birds are, well, not getting eaten. So that's a very interesting finding, that there is obviously depredation by cats, of cats by coyotes, but then the fear factor, which is what we're going to explore next, from the owners actually is more than an additive effect. It's like a multiplicative effect. If not, it's not just removing the cats, it's really removing a lot of predation on the birds. So we were talking last time at the end of the talk about wolves and rivers in the Yellowstone. That is probably one of the most well-known study at the moment in ecology and landscape of fear. This is also the one that funded or discovered, put the landscape of fear on the map. And it started actually with a hydrologist, believing or not, Bechta, who was later joined by Bill Ripple, who is an ecologist. In the 2000s, get to the Yellowstone, and being an hydrologist, well, he looks at river, contrary to what actually normal people do or look at when they go to Yellowstone. So the geysers, the waterfall, bisons, a lot of elk, and the beautiful color of aspen in fall. And as Bechta looks at the rivers, he's stunned by the structure of the river. Very, very flat. Rivers very wide river, but with very steep banks as well. And the riparian vegetation, so those trees and the bushes that usually grow on the river bank, are completely either absent or completely overgrazed. And now it's just like, this is not normal. This is really shouldn't look like that. So what's been happening until now? Well, now we need to throw the wolves in the equation. So in 1926, the last wolves were killed in the Yellowstone extermination program. And then in parallel to that, elk migration was stopped by fences. So now not only elk don't have predators anymore, but they're also stuck in the Yellowstone. I'm going to tell me, for elk, there's probably worst place to be stuck in, except when you start really overgrazing and you affect your environment and your ecosystem. And in response to that, willows, aspens, and cottonwoods became overgrazed. Barely any regeneration. The woodlands, especially around the river, are just fastly disappearing. In 1973, Nixon comes up with the Endangered Species Act, which is basically an act that protects and restores species facing extinction. First on the list of the species, you've got it, the gray wolves. A lot of people were not happy with that, but everybody's really happy with policies. And so by 1995, 8 wolves are translocated back to the Yellowstone from the Canadian Rockies. In 1996, Bechta observed the very, very barren riverbanks. And in 2000, he comes back because now he's got a problem and he wants to understand. And to his surprise, he observes regeneration in the riparian vegetation. By 2005, the wolves are present everywhere in the Yellowstone, and the densities are going up. And now, strong with the knowledge of all the other ecologists that came before them, Bechta and Ripple start to ask a very crucial question. Can the wolves be protecting the trees? The recovery of the wolves is now leading to trees growing back, and then trees going back, stabilizing the river bank, and then the rivers are now changing their morphology. So this is where the very sexy talk about wolves affecting the course of rivers. Before we move forward in the Yellowstone, we need to learn a bit more about wolves and actually learn about, from the longest standing species on wolves, who is conducted or led by David Meck, started in the 60s, early 60s, in the Isle Royale in the Lake Superior in Michigan. So we're still in the States. And there, the main prey of wolf is moose. And David Meck, back in the days, they didn't have GPS data, they GPS collars, they didn't have camera traps, they didn't have drones. They had to just follow the wolves. So they spend a lot of time following the wolves and look at what they eat and monitoring the vegetation in this island and all of that. And as the population of wolves fluctuates, they find something very interesting. In period where there is an increase in the population of wolves, so high predation, the population of moose is going down. Okay, up to here, no surprising. But what they found though, is that the trees were getting fatter tree rings. So for those of us who are not used to trees in temperate forest, it's not like in Africa, we have a growing season. So there's summer, spring, summer is a growing season, and then autumn and winter is shut down. So the trees basically grow in rings. And in paired with a lot of wolves, the rings are thick. So with the wolves, the forest grows. Interesting. And that's been going on for quite some time. So if we look at the number of wolves and then the number of moose and then the growth in the fear, this is how it looks like. Lots of wolves, fewer wolves, lots of moose, smaller ring. And then next one, bigger wolf, a lot of wolves, lower moose population, fatter ring. So it seems that, you know, the idea of wolf protecting the trees is not that far-fetched. On top of that, what Meg found by examining the kill sites of wolves is that they don't kill at random. They usually target the weaker individual. So the young one, the one who have already a malformation or a broken leg, or a very low, very lean bone marrow, so they're usually not in good condition. Keep that in mind, that's going to be important for later. And we go back to the Yellowstone. And Rispel and Bechter now decide, well, we haven't been measuring the rings of the trees, but what we can do is look at historical photographs. And what they found is like the last aspen growth was actually on the year that the last wolves were killed in the Yellowstone. And on steep riverbank in the 2000s, there is now cottonwood regeneration. So 10 years after, well, that was 2020 there, but basically 10 years after the wolves were reintroduced and roaming everywhere, there is regeneration of the riparian vegetation. But now, exactly what's the process there? The idea is a bit the same as we were talking about orcas and otters, except that in this case, there is not enough wolf to just consume all those elk and lead to a decrease in the population. They just can't eat that many elk. And so they decide, well, the only way we can learn about that is actually looking at wolves, and for the lucky ones, spending hours, weeks, months in the field following wolves and looking at them hunting. What they found is that the hunt is very often unsuccessful. Wolves are cursorial hunters, like hyenas, so they basically run their prey down. But what they found is like usually those wolves were much more successful at catching and killing elk on the steep riverbank. And now, great correlation, actually the riparian vegetation is regenerating the fastest and the better on the steep riverbank where the elks are killed more often. So the conclusion is actually, it's not that the wolves are killing the elk on those places, it's that the elk knows that it runs a higher risk of being killed on those steeper banks, so they just don't go there anymore, giving the tree a chance, well, the sapling a chance to survive and the tree to grow. Then and there, the ecology of fear, the concept of ecology is fear, and fear was coined by Landry in 1999, and then finally the landscape of fear, same person, in 2001. That was the first time that those terms were used in ecology. Today, if you were to run a search in Google Scholar with landscape of fear only in the title, you would get about 7,000 results. We are 20 years down the line. So what are the mechanisms of the ecology of fear? In a predator-free environment, the prey are free to use the higher quality habitat, They can forage at very high rate because, well, they're not scared. They don't need to check anything, and they have lower stress level. So their immune system is not impaired. They're very chill. They can reproduce. They have higher survival, and so they attain higher density. Throw a predator in the system, and you have two effects that are adding on to each other. The first one, the obvious one, what we call consumptive effect, is predation. Okay, the wolves kill the elk. And because the elk is more likely to be found in high quality habitat, this is where the mortality is the highest. As a response to that, because the elk now get scared, so that's the fear effect, they move to suboptimal habitat. So their diet is less nutritious. They increase their vigilance. They can't just afford to just eat, and not pay attention, because if they do, they get caught by the predator. So they have less time to devote to lower quality food, and they also chronically stress. In human, we know, and we know in animals as well, chronic stress is no good. It's no good for your fertility. It's no good for your immune system. It's just bad news. So as a result, there is a decrease in food intake, there is a reduced reproductive system, and there is lower survival, both because they are eaten and because they are scared. So overall, there is a decrease in prey abundance, and very importantly, there is a change in how the prey, where the prey are, and when they are there, and why they do that. Why do we call it the landscape of fear? It's because when you think about it on a map, this is basically how it looks like. So this is the area, the use of an area by a predator. And then you see in red, that's the area that are often used by the predator when you're most likely to find it. And as you get towards the blue, far less risk, the predator is rarely there. Okay, if we look at it in 3D, that looks like this. There are areas where there is a peak of risk, very, very high risk, and other area you're kind of in a valley of risk, and so you're pretty safe. When we think about the Yellowstone, yeah, it makes sense. That could be just the home range of a wolf, right? And then at that peak there, the red peak, there is the dense site, and so this is the area as an elk that you should really, really avoid. Some prey are not that lucky. Some prey have multiple predators. It's often the case in Africa, like this is here. And so each predator has its own utilization map. They don't all occur at the same time, at the same place. So a prey has basically to contend with all of that and integrate all the risk from the different predator. This is where it's become very important. The response of the prey is based on their perceived predation risk, of what they assess the risk being, not the real risk. If it was a perfect match, the prey would never get killed because he would know all the time what was the risk. And that is crucial, because a mismatch between real and perceived, if the mismatch is too big, so let's say the prey is too scared, it's going to lead to increased vigilance, lower foraging rate, more stress. Ultimately, the prey is going to kill itself from stress. If the prey is too chilled, well, it's going to get killed, period. So no good. And as Lima and Dill say, there are few failures that are as unforgiving as the failure to avoid a predator, because being killed greatly decreases future fitness. So now that we understand the process between, it's good, eh? Basically from whatever it could be to zero. So now that we understand the processes between the predator and prey, let's look a bit closer, because in that system, there is also not a single predator. There is the wolves, but there is also the coyote. And in the absence of the wolves, coyotes became the top dog. Now they were just the master, they're the biggest predator. So their group size greatly increased. They're starting to get bolder and bolder and killing large prey. But with now wolves back, coyote population is decreasing. They have higher mortality. If wolves encounter coyotes, they will kill them. They form smaller packs. And they also fearful of wolves, to the point where those coyotes now are establishing their territory kind of in between wolves' territories. So where those wolves' territories overlap on the edges, when wolves are rarely there, this is where you find the coyotes, because somewhere else is just too risky. As a result, the prey, the pronghorn that was heavily killed by coyotes, pronghorn population now rebounding. Pronghorn are not really killed by wolves, so those populations are recovering. On top of that, because the wolf is now supplying a lot of carrion, other scavenger, and the coyote is not monopolizing it, a lot of other scavenger population are increasing. So red foxes, crows and magpies, vultures. So the benefit of an increase in the top dog, literally population here, has really rippling effect down to things that are very, very small. I mean, when we talk about carrion, we can also talk about beetles and all those kind of stuff and microbe. So this really really having a very, very wide effect. So what's the wolf cascade? Like literally, when we talk about rivers, without the wolves, elk are free from predation and they can basically be wherever they want. They're going to choose the best habitat close to water, and they're going to basically prevent any tree regeneration. As the wolf come back, the elk has to basically now be fearful and move. So it's getting killed, which provide carrions to a lot of different species. Reprieve from grazing, so the trees are now regenerating and growing. Other scavengers are now benefiting from the carrion that is provided by the wolves. Beavers are coming back because now, well, guess what? There's wood, there's trees next to the river, so the beaver can again build dams on the river, which bring with it all the fish and the ecosystem that lives in those rivers. Even brown bears are benefiting because the bushes from which they eat the berries are now not overgrazed anymore, and so they actually can feed. So it's one of the first example, actually, and maybe even only, where the recovery of one large carnivores helps another large carnivores. But that wasn't enough for Bechta and Ripple. They say, we can't stop there. We're already very famous. We know about the wolves. We need to go and see if that can happen in other ecosystems. That's been one of the big debate around that. It's like, okay, well, that's the wolf, that's Yellowstone, that's one ecosystem. Maybe it doesn't happen anyway, everywhere else. Well, actually, kind of does. Being American, they stay in America, and now they move south, and they go to Utah in the States, still in Zion National Park. And in 2000, they get there, and Zion is basically becoming a victim of its own success. And in those canyons that are extremely epic and visually, kind of striking, there is now increase of tourism. Lots and lots of tourists in those canyons, which leads to a complete disruption of the cougars, which are mountain lions, if you want to call them like this, the main predator in this area. And not necessarily that they are killed by tourists, but they are scared. They are disturbed. And so their numbers are plummeting. As a result, their main prey, the mule deer in that ecosystem, explodes, overgraze, gallery forest begin to die. So same riparian vegetation is overgrazed, and the riverbank starts to erode. And as a result, the deer are now looking not so great, to the point where actually tourists are complaining and go to the park authority and say, no, we need to do something because we don't want to see thin deers. And now Bechta and Ripple think, well, maybe we just need to find another ecosystem very close to that, and where the mountain lions still occur. They didn't have to go too far, just 15 kilometers away from the Zion Canyon, there is North Creek Canyon, exactly the same ecosystem, but there is no us, there is no tourism. In this place, there's still a lot of cougars that are running around, and they discover not even just a different ecosystem, a whole new world. In those places, as the cougar population is still there, the mule deer population is kept low. There is high mortality, and they are scared, so they don't spend so much time next to the river. As a result, the cottonwood growing on the riverside, no problem, still forest, gallery forest, everything is beautiful, which results to a huge increase in biodiversity. So usually when we talk about those big things, we think, oh yeah, there's more deers and more species of deers and more shrews and more mice. Yeah, well, there is also more insects. There is also more snakes, more reptiles. So just one mammalian predator controls that whole chain all the way down to reptile, but also effects in the water, in the fish community and the invertebrate community in the water. So at this stage, I would like to just take a brief pause and talk about what's happening in Africa. Because when I talk about this and I say wolves affect river, a lot of people say, oh yeah, can lions affect waterhole? Well, yes and no. The answer, yes, because they will definitely, and we know for sure, affect how their prey uses the water hole, how and when. So that has an effect on the water hole itself. The no is actually most probably the preeminent answer, and the reason being that lions are not alone. They operate in an ecosystem with a lot of large predators as well. So here they're going to be spotted hyena, cheetah, leopards, and then a whole guild of mesocarnivores as well. So it's extremely unlikely that just the removal of one species, even if this is a top species, will have a profound effect on the landscape. It will surely have an effect because all the carnivores interact with each other. But to the point that, let's say, waterhole would disappear or would be completely overused, extremely unlikely. But at this stage, we're not exactly too sure, especially with those complex guilds. Most of the study we've been talking about now are in ecosystem with this one single top predator. And this is great that we don't know, because this is what I'm focusing on. And then if we knew, then I need to find another job. So I'm happy that we still don't know. Let's hope we don't know still in the next 50 years, and then I'll be happy and I can retire. So from what we've seen up to now, there is definitely strong mounting evidence from everywhere in the world that predators in an ecosystem are very important. And given the fact that they are really fast disappearing through their range in the world, people are starting to ask, okay, now we know what happens, what can we do about it? And this is where come in 1998 by Soule, again, that's a name that is now familiar, the concept of rewilding. And basically they look at all those protected areas and they say, well, they just act as a big island. Yes, they're big, but they're still not connected. Remember the island biogeography theory? And most of them now are devoid of large predators. So we need to come up with a concept that is rewilding that is based on 3 C's. The first one is those cause area. So that's the protected area. That needs to be connected by corridors, so then population can expand. That also greatly reduces the rate of extinction, as we saw earlier. And the key is carnivores, but not just one species of carnivore. We need the whole guild for them to operate their effect on ecosystem. And from them started a completely crazy idea from Dolan and Green that was published in Nature. And they proposed, well, why don't we bring everything back to America? Because I mean, back in the days, very far days, there were mammoths and cheetahs and camels. So let's just bring everything back, all the mega herbivores with their predators. And then there we go. We have a functioning ecosystem and everybody is happy. And it was just, that idea was just based on that very central concept that large carnivore loss has huge effect on ecosystem that are not really positive. And then suddenly, everybody lost that idea, and everybody got scared of having predators roaming in the backyards, to the point where they received letter upon letter, like, if you let lion loose in the States and one of them venture in my garden, I will shoot it and send you its head and whatever. So people becoming completely crazy about fear, just about fear, basically, and completely lost the idea that actually that was crazy, but I was based on a concept that is worth exploring. At this stage, a lot of other people as well started to propose, what about us as a predator? What about us basically taking the main role as a predator here, and then having human as a super predator? I mean, truth be told, we are probably the one that kills the most things in the world at the moment. But can we really have the same effect as large predator? The answer is no, for different reasons. The first one, at least in the current state of affairs, the first one is that there's 2 reasons why we hunt. The first one is trophy hunting. And trophy hunting basically targets usually, so trophy animals, which are usually males, old males. And at this stage, every ecologist will tell you, if you just kill old male in a population, you are not regulating the population. Hence, yeah, part of the population will be at risk, but the rest will be fine, and you will not barely touch the reproductive success of that species. Second way of hunting is like, we are hunting for meat. If we're hunting for meat, we are looking at killing the healthiest animals. the biggest. This is not how predation occurs. Predator, most, if not all of them, targets the weaker individual because this is the one that are the easiest to catch, that are the one that are sick, that are the one who have genetic problems. So predators, by targeting those weaker individual, actually clean the population and keep it healthy. Another problem is usually when we hunt, and it's true actually everywhere, we have seasons. There's seasons we hunt and seasons we don't hunt. We hunt where we can access. So we hunt close to roads or to trails or to cities, which means that the landscape of fear is extremely predictable. If it's predictable, we don't have fear anymore because we know exactly what to do. What landscape of fear for natural predator works because there is a risk all the time and you need to be able to predict it. In our case, there's just no risk. We're going to hunt during the day and during autumn in Europe and winter here, and then that's it. So there will be refuge in time for the population and in space as well for the prey to keep growing up. So it was a crazy idea based on a great concept. It didn't really fly at the time, even though now rewilding is on the tip of every tongue, and we talk about that a lot. Now that we've explored the whole doom and gloom of this carnivore extension, I just want to finish with a sliver of hope. And that is the recovery of large predator in the Northern Hemisphere, particularly in Europe, for once. Europe is featuring on the map for good reasons. And a lot of those large carnivores are now recovering. So that's going to be the grey wolf, the brown bear, the European lynx. They are naturally recovering in their range. Where I was born and grew up, there was no wolves when I was born and grew up. Maybe I wouldn't have played in the forest so much, I don't know. But I know that 20 years ago, my dad did see a wolf in the mountains close to where we live. And now we actually have wolves roaming around that are causing a bit of havoc among the farmers there with their sheep and the pigs. The packs are still quite small, but they are naturally recovering, actually coming all the way back from Italy. Another huge success story, but also at huge cost, it's Iberian lynx. It's one of the most threatened felid in the world. And it was in June this year, moved from endangered to vulnerable. Huge success. The Iberian lynx basically lives in the south of the Iberic Peninsula in Spain, in an area that is heavily transformed with agriculture, very intensive agriculture. And the effort for the conservation and restoration has been huge. I don't even know how much that has cost. It is a win. It might be in proportion a small win, but it is still a win. Another thing that we are familiar in Africa as well is the creation of transfrontier area where the protected area are connected with each other. Here in Namibia, we're familiar with the CASA, so that's the Kavango Zambezi, which basically links 5 countries, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, and Angola, together, putting the protected area together and creating corridors so that the natural processes through the food web can actually keep occurring. There can be immigration, there can be dispersal, and carnivores especially have much larger place to roam. Another classic example from our friend down south is the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Park. Zimbabwe again, this time was Mozambique and South Africa, with Kruger in there, just creating those huge tract of land, which are where carnivores are at least partly, in part of that landscape, fully protected. Another thing that we learned recently, quite painfully, I must say, is what the COVID pandemic did to animals. Not the COVID per se, but how we as humans reacted to it. As the movement of human was highly restricted, in Europe, for instance, what happened is that the brown bear, started to use areas, the optimal habitat that has been predicted to be optimal from model using data way before COVID. And those areas that you see now in red, with the red dots, have been predicted as the best area for the bears. But when we were there and fully active and mobile, the bear never or barely used them because they were less, there was disturbance. And as we stopped using those areas because there was lockdown, very quickly, in less than a year, the bear just shift their special use and use those habitats. So just in a space of a year, there is enough behavioral change that the animal can use the best habitat for them. Another one, somewhat 170 ecologists around the world finally decided to be smart and put all the GPS tracking data together of terrestrial mammal, at least, and they look at what happened during COVID lockdown. And what they found, so I can't remember how many species, but like that's a lot, huge data published in Science, that suddenly during the lockdown where human couldn't move anymore, animals moved much more. They could roam in a lot of places that were not accessible to us anymore. Interestingly as well, they started to use areas much closer to roads, which usually animals avoid because of disturbance, because of high risk, because of noise pollution, because of pollution per se. So very, very quickly, animals just adapted to that. So what it means is they're really capable of adapting super quickly to any change. So we just need to give them a chance. So there's actually not going into lockdown pandemic again, but there's actually a lot of small things that we can do that would not cost us so much, but that would really help animals and carnivores in general to use the best area for them. So that's it. That's the end of part 2 and the end of the seminar at the end. And there's just one thing that I would like to touch on that I didn't really talk about, that's very present in the book as well, is the philosophical component of all that story with carnivores. And we need to recognize how large carnivores in history have shaped our psyche and our cultures. So when you think about lion being a symbol of strength in a lot of cultures, everybody fearing the wolf and everybody thinking the coyote or the fox as the cunning animal. They not only shaped that, but they also shaped our evolution as a species. So most of us here probably have been lucky enough to be sitting in a car within meters of a lion suddenly roaring, especially at night. And you just felt your whole rib cage vibrate and a very, very, very primal zone of your brain just being activated, pure fear. Like that animal is an animal that can and will kill me if I give him a chance. So if you have that experience, you know what I'm talking about here. And when we think about our ancestors that a few million years ago ventured out of the forest on those 2 legs that are very flimsy and they're not fast and they're not strong and they don't have claws and they don't have fangs. And now they venture out in the plains and they have to face all those carnivores. Most of them, so more species, but most of them much bigger than the one we have to face today. So if we think about those hominids just suddenly venturing down out in the open, maybe we can think that the weapons that we have today would not have evolved so fast if it was just to kill for ourselves and to feed ourselves, that if it was also to defend ourselves, to protect ourselves from those predators that would be capable of eating us. And so maybe, just maybe actually, if those large predators had not been roaming the wilderness at the same time as us, we wouldn't be here today debating about the importance in ecosystem. And in the world of Dolan and Green, perhaps nothing makes us more human and feel more vulnerable than a large predator that could kill and eat us. And that's it. Thank you very much.